It should be accessible when people need to know, but I don't think you have much hope of reaching a public that doesn't have a professional need to know.
The reason that I think central banks are buying, and the Fed is not buying, but there are other central banks that are. And I think that's because they recognize that we are in a inflationary environment worldwide, that all the major economies, not just the United States, but the European Union, the UK, Japan, I mean, everybody has kept interest rates too low. Every government rather has run up debt, not to the degree that our government has, but they've still run it up. And there's no political courage anywhere to level with voters and deliver the bad news that, hey, we've overpromised and we've either got to cut your benefits or raise your taxes. Nobody wants to fess up. Nobody wants to default on their debt, because obviously, you don't look too good when you default. That's pretty embarrassing to have to admit that you can't pay your bills. And so everybody's going to inflate. Everyone's going to print money. And so the value of currencies is going to fall. Inflation is going to continue to increase worldwide and persist. And I think central banks know that the dollar's days are numbered. The dollar acts as the primary reserve. So if you want to know, hey, why does a particular currency have value? So, hey, why does the New Zealand dollar have value? Well, it's backed up by our reserves. What are your reserves? Well, they're U.S. dollars. All right. Well, what if the U.S. dollar doesn't have any value? Well, then you've got nothing. You're backed by nothing. Right? It always reminds me of that, the Superman movie, the first one where Christopher Reeve, catches Lois Lane. She's falling from the plane, and he says, "I got you," and she says, "You got me. Who's got you?" Right? And so if there's nothing behind the dollar, and the dollar is all that's backing up some other currency, well, then the currency has no backing, and the dollar's not Superman, so it's gonna fall back down to earth. But I think these central banks recognize, okay, if there's going to be a dollar crisis, a loss of confidence in the dollar, then this could be a crisis in the monetary system. So what do? How are we going to back up our currency? How are we going to convince people that there's real value here? Well, let's back it up with gold. Let's have gold reserves, because that's real. So if you say, oh, what's backing up your currency? Well, gold. Okay, you got something behind it. You've got something real, because that's where all these paper currencies came from in the first place. They were liabilities for gold. Central banks initially only issued paper currencies because they had gold. It was just a more convenient way for people to use the gold. They used the paper instead of the gold, but the only reason they used the paper was because it was backed up by gold. And you could actually take your paper currency to the central bank and you could get your gold if you wanted it. But there was no reason to get it, because people would take the paper because they trusted that they could get the gold whatever they wanted. And so nobody went and took it, right? And we just started using paper. The governments took advantage of the fact that people weren't showing up to get their gold. And they said, hey, wait a minute, there's nobody actually getting their gold, so let's just keep creating paper that we don't actually have gold behind. And then, like the U.S. did that. And then all of a sudden, in the early 70s, Charles de Gaulle out of France, the most popular, was like, wait a minute, the U.S. is printing all this money. They got these budget deficits. They're fighting the war in Vietnam. They got this Great Society program. They've got this moon mission. Where's all the money coming from? They don't have all that gold. And de Gaulle is like, you know what? I want my gold. I'm not going to hold these dollars. Brought them in. Give me my gold. And that's when we had to shut the gold window, because we didn't have, the jig was up. But the thing was, after we went off the gold standard, which was supposed to be temporary, but here it is 50 years later, we didn't go back. But we kept on printing money. And then once the government saw that we could just issue money backed by nothing and everybody would take it, that's when we just turned on the presses. And that's when the government really became Santa Claus, because now the voters can have everything they want. It's all free. Just print up some money and pay for it, right? And so That's how the government got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the debt got bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're about to pay the consequences. The
Yeah.
chickens are coming home to roost, and there's a lot of them. But the reason for negative interest rates was the U.S. because we went to zero. Now, you had Europe that wanted to have a stimulative policy. And normally, since the dollar is the reserve currency, if you wanted to stimulate, Keynesian style, you would want your interest rates to be lower than the rates in the US. Right? So whatever our rates are, you got to be lower. Well, if we're at zero, how do you get below zero? Well, they had to go negative. It was the only way to be below zero. But had we never lowered rates to zero, let's say the Fed only went to 2%, the ECB never would have gone to zero. They never would have. They wouldn't have gone negative. They would have said, okay, we'll go to one. The U.S. is at 2, we'll go to 1. But but we set the bar really low at zero. So the only way to have lower rates than the U.S. was to be negative. And as absurd as it was, that's what happened. And of course, it had disastrous consequences for Europe.
Mhm.
And now that rates are rising in Europe, a lot of the damage is going to rise to the surface. A lot of it, was being papered under. But, they did incredible damage to their economy in Europe and Japan, in pursuit of inflation, because all of these central banks justified their negative rates by claiming that they didn't have enough inflation. It was like, oh, this is required. We need more inflation. We got to get up to 2%, as if this was some kind of emergency, that prices weren't rising fast enough. Like the average European or Japanese, the big problem was, God, I wish food was just more expensive. Every year the price barely rises. I mean, I really wish when I go to the supermarket, I can see a 2% increase every year in the price of food, because, this stability in food prices has really, really got me scared. Or like, oh my God, I went to the supermarket and I was able to buy food for less money than the time I went before. That's a disaster. We need some central bank to save me from this. I mean, this is horrible, having to buy less expensive food. So,
Yeah.
so to just, and now, of course, food is like skyrocketing. Now people have to eat dog food because they can't afford human food. But okay, great. At least it's not, going down in price. So the central bank saved us from that. We're already in a recession. And so the thing that they did is just change the definition and pretend we're not in one, right? Because there's nothing they can do about it. So you might as well pretend that we're not in a recession. The problem is the recession is going to get so bad, I think, next year, that they can't pretend anymore. But yeah, I mean, they're trapped between a rock and a hard place, because they can't do anything about the recession, because the only tool the Fed has is inflation. That's how they've gotten us out of every other recession in the, let's say, the post-war time period, was by creating inflation. They print money, lower interest rates to reflate another bubble, to replace the one that burst. But the bubbles always burst as a result of the inflationary policies that inflate them. And then when they have to raise rates to try to prevent the inflation from getting too out of hand, they prick the bubble, everything crashes, and then they start the process all over again, only they have to do it bigger because, the economy is more screwed up, and it needs even more monetary heroin to get high again. So, they just replace one bubble with a bigger bubble, and the country, you know, gets worse. The structure of the economy continues to erode away. But we've now reached a point where the main problem is inflation. They've created so much inflation to so-called solve the problems of the past, that the problem we got now is inflation itself. Well, when the government's solution has now become the problem, they're out of solutions. Because how are you going to create more inflation to solve a problem of too much inflation? You can't. So if now a lot of people think, well, it won't be a problem because we can't have recession and inflation at the same time. They're wrong. They don't understand inflation. They don't understand recession. In fact, historically, the worst inflations that countries have ever experienced happen during recessions. They don't happen when times are good. They happen when times are bad. So we're going to have a severe recession and high inflation at the same time, which means there is no government remedy for that recession. We have to allow the recession to run its natural course without the government doing anything to try to soften the blow. And because of how big the bubble was and how many mistakes were made while that bubble was inflating, this is going to be a long, deep, painful recession. And if the government tries to make it less painful, it's only going to make it more painful. That is the problem, because if they try to do anything about the recession, inflation is going to get worse. And that is actually the bigger problem, or the biggest problem that most people have right now, is they can't afford the prices because they're already too high. And if they go much higher, then it'll be even